I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to this event and why we're doing this. My name is Mohammed Ahmedullah, and I've been working for Stepney Community Trust since 2011, and we have done about 5 heritage projects during that time, mostly covering East India Company, Bengal, Bangladesh, and so on. About 3 years ago, we started to learn a little bit more about jute. We all know about jute, those who come from Bangladesh, and also some colleagues who have joined from Dundee, they also know about jute. And some colleagues from Calcutta, they also know about jute. But our generation, well, I'm quite old, but the new generation, but generally we know very little about the history of jute. We sometimes hear from people, that jute was something very big and produced by peasants, cultivators in Bengal that powered the British Empire's industry, capitalism, and made them so much money. But there are horror stories as well, we have recently found out. So we wanted to do a project involving the community. So this is not an academic project. It's not done by any university. We got help, from like British Library, Kew Gardens, that has lots of interesting jute things in their archives. And also we visited Dundee, the Verdant Works, the Dundee Jute Mill. They helped us. We organized some sessions there and visited many, location and sites of mills. And 2 colleagues here, Anne and Martin, they're from Dundee actually. They interviewed some local people who worked in the jute mills and jute factory, and their stories are in this book. So we developed a project and got some funding from the Heritage Lottery. And this Stepney Community Trust. And this project involves several elements. One is, research on history. Second element is to interview some people in this country, especially from a Bangladeshi, Bengali origin, who have had experience or knowledge of jute, before they came to this country, just to see something, what they know, what they have heard, and their particular experience. And then third element was to produce some jute crafts. So we engaged about 15 to 20 people, and I brought, raw jute from Bangladesh. I brought jute textiles, many kind of jute textile, some dyed, some golden color, the normal color, and some mix jute and cotton. That's what they told us. And then there were some saris, and some scarves. They had jute embroideries, and they look so beautiful, and so about, say, 15 or so people from the community, they worked on producing beautiful jute crafts, and we had an exhibition. And this is the book, that we produced. And I think about probably nearly more than 25 people contributed in different ways, to the book. And this is about nearly 400-page book. And Tariq Ali, who is the speaker today, his book was very good. It was quite prominent, Many people in our group read bits and pieces and developed their understanding. Hang on, I have to just send some people the link. They're finding it difficult to join. Okay. And I was also fascinated, by reading Tariq Ali's book, because his book, for me, was the first one that actually looked at, the peasants, their life, and how that was linked to worldwide, ups and downs of the prices and demands of, and so it helped me, understand a little bit more. So what I did is to develop a fiction, quite a bit based on insights that I gained from Tariq's book about the life of Bengal peasants, who worked with jute. The other element I incorporated my story was the fact that so many jute ships, came from Calcutta and few from Chittagong from late a, say 1878, I think the first ship from Chittagong came, but from Dundee, sorry, from Calcutta to Dundee was coming from the 1840s, I think, if I remember correctly, and they were largely manned by Lashkars, Asian Lashkars. Um, Not exclusively, there were Eastern European and other people, but Lashkars, like the Chinese and Arabs and Yemenis and so on. But that story is completely missing in the story that they tell about Dundee. So we discussed with colleagues, and I just hope that they will bring that as well. Because if you look at British newspaper archive, there are hundreds and hundreds of stories about Lashkars in Dundee, during that period. So that's really important. So I developed this fiction story to try and bring to notice, some of the missing bits. Today is not my turn to speak, so I think I won't say much about Tariq. You have read a little bit about him in the publicity, and we'll pass on to Tariq. He will speak, and then you will have chance to engage with him and ask him questions and so on. So Tariq, bhai, it's now up to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a rare opportunity to get to speak to a non-academic community that's not, it's a real rare, and I congratulate you and the Stepney Community Trust on this wonderful project with real public history that matters so much more, I feel, in many ways than what we do inside universities. Can I share my screen? I did have some slides.
Of course. How do I do this?
Yeah, let me try and see if I can do it. I don't know if I think I might be there. Does
Oh
that
yes.
work?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That works. Yeah.
So I mean, and thank you everyone for having read the book, or I mean, having read parts of it. I was assuming that I would actually just give like the book came out now, it's 7 year 2018, so it's, yeah, 7 years, and I haven't written a second book, so I'm under pressure at work. So it's a nice opportunity to escape the pressures of the second book and revisit the first book. So I thought I'd just give sort of an overview of what the book is about and what my arguments are. Just very brief, I mean, 30 minutes, 35 minutes perhaps, and then hopefully take questions. I'm so glad Ahmadullah Bhai began with the Lashkar and jute connection. Jute was the envelope of global trade. Jute, in its heyday, its main use was sacking, and as until it was replaced by containers, essentially, where plastics, containers, and cardboard. Jute fabrics used to be the premier packaging material of global trade. And over here, I think we can see in a sort of a dockyard image of jute sacks going through, and we can imagine the numbers of Lashkars that would be intersecting with the sacks in that form. While the sack circulated globally, however, the fiber was produced solely in one small corner of the world, the Bengal Delta, the alluvial lands formed from the silt deposits of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna river systems. The shaded districts on this map in today's Bangladesh produce close to 90% of the world's jute. And in these districts, jute acreage, the amount of land under jute, rose from about 50,000 acres in the beginning of the 1850s to about 4 million acres by the 1900s. So that's a humongous increase in 50 years, the heyday of jute. Fibers connected the Bengal peasantry to the global marketplace, entangled them in circuits of commerce and capital, subjected them to the rhythms and vicissitudes of global commodity prices. The primary question posed by my book is this: what happens to this mostly Muslim Bengal peasantry once their lives become so thoroughly enmeshed in global capital? The book looks at transformation, various facets of peasant life, in dress and domesticity, in diet, in religious sentiments, in ideas of ethics, morality, and justice, and in their political commitments and action. So the main thesis of the book is trying to understand what happens to a subsistence cultivating class once their lives are completely enmeshed and entangled in the ups and downs of jute prices in places like Dundee, Liverpool, London, and Calcutta, factors totally out of their hands. I'll organize these three as themes. I think are sort of major themes in the book, and I'll organize my talk around them, sort of understanding the impact of market entanglements on these spheres of life. The expansion of jute, unlike that of indigo or even opium to a certain extent, was not carried out by colonial coercion. Instead, the fibre seemed to have expanded through peasant initiative, through the independent and autonomous decisions of tens of thousands of peasant households to devote more and more land to commercial fibre instead of subsistence rice. Economic historians of agrarian Bengal have demonstrated, and my own research confirms, that the Bengal peasantry were price responsive. That is, they responded to high jute prices by bringing more land under jute, and they responded to lower jute prices by shifting land from jute to rice. All of which begs the question, why did a subsistence peasantry care about market prices? Usually the answer is because landlords increase their rents and they have to get more cash to pay off landlord rents. This period, however, was a period of declining and retreating rents, what Sugata Bose calls the end of the rent and revenue offensive. It was not new pressures that new sort of cash pressures that attracted farmers to jute, but rather the new and novel consumer goods that had only recently become available in rural marketplaces. My argument is that it was not a sort of a cold calculus of prices and profits, but rather a hot desire for new kinds of consumption that drove the 19th century expansion of jute. Let me illustrate through quotations. I quote from a colonial official writing in 1891. Owing to improved facilities of export and the growing value of jute, the standard of comfort in the cultivating class has distinctly advanced during the decade. The riot wears better clothes and shoes than his father, eats more abundantly, and sleeps on a more luxurious bed. His cottage is brightly and cheaply lit by a rude kerosene lamp. He kindles his fire with Swedish safety matches, which have driven the English product from the market. When ill, he calls in a doctor and uses quinine and other costly drugs. Quoting from a different colonial official in 1913, the jute cultivator is notoriously improvident. The high prices he has been getting during the past 10 years has turned his head altogether. The large amount of cash that he handles has made him extravagant, and his style of living has risen in a remarkable degree. He eats much better, wears better clothes, and lives a cleaner and more sanitary life than before. His house has improved, corrugated iron has taken the place of thatch, and the compounds and gardens are cleaner. He educates his children in many cases, sending them to English schools, pardon, which are fast
ওইটা
springing
আমাকে
up.
দিবে, তাহলে আমি কথা বলতে পারি। এটার মধ্যে মাইক্রোফোন আছে, এটাতে মাইক্রোফোন।
Which are fast springing up and calls in doctors in cases of illness. He indulges more frequently in litigation and marries more wives, paying a good deal more for each than before. These anecdotal observations are supported by statistics of internal trade in Bengal. The jute growing districts consumed more imported Manchester cloth per capita than Bengal as a whole. And trade reports show a rapid increase in imports of cloth, umbrellas, metal utensils, and kerosene oil into jute growing districts during the late 19th century. There's also a sharp increase in civil lawsuits contested in district courts, and an increase in enrollments in primary schools, though very low, under 10% of the population, but enrollments were much higher in the jute growing districts of East Bengal than in all of Bengal. These are the forms of consumption that were being financed by jute profits during the late 19th century. I like this image for two reasons, though it's not a contemporary image, it's a later image. First, corrugated metal roofs became a symbol of jute cultivation in the late 19th century. Mukhtar Ahmed Siddiqui, a sub-inspector of madrasas in Shirajganj, wrote in 1916, I quote, "In every village and in every neighborhood we see many tin houses only because of jute." Or Gobindo Chandra Das, a small-town poet also from Shirajganj, wrote in a poem which he called the jute song, Patergan, "Those who did not have straw hovels, now their houses are topped with four-cornered, eight-cornered, shiny tin." I also like this image because it depicts a certain paradox at the heart of jute cultivation, a paradox in colonial eyes, the colonial observer's eyes. Jute cultivators were both prosperous because they were getting more cash, and backward because they weren't using their new kinds of consumption to fashion modern lives. They were using corrugated iron they continue to dwell in one-room dwellings built around a central courtyard, which each dwelling space having multiple purposes, storage, entertainment, sleeping, instead of modern dwellings, which would be multi-room dwellings with specialized spaces for different activities. They continued to wear lungis instead of switching to pants, trousers with pockets, and shirts with buttons. They created this they did not use their earnings and incomes to fashion the kinds of modern life expected by colonial observers, but to fashion a distinctive peasant modernity. This led to all kinds of paradoxical descriptions of the Bengal jute cultivating peasantry by colonial officials. I quote one of them. I quote a colonial official describing encountering, I quote, an old man whose clothes would disgrace a scarecrow, admitting that he has sold his jute for as much as 500 rupees. So this is the kind of new forms of peasant modernity, we can call it, but new forms of peasant livelihood, peasant life, domesticity, habits of eating that are crafted around market relations with the growing exports of jute. Let me shift to my second theme and to a different period. The late 19th century was a period of relative prosperity in the jute cultivating delta. Consistently high jute prices and relative food security meant that farmers were able to finance new forms of consumption and experiment with new ways of living. This relative prosperity would come to a sharp collapse with the outbreak of World War I. At the beginning of World War I, jute markets collapsed. Jute prices fell from 10 to 12 rupees a mon, 40 kgs, to about rupees 1 to 2 a mon if you could find a buyer at all. The market collapse at the beginning of World War I began a process of immiseration. A combination of unfavorable global markets, deteriorating ecological conditions, and fragmenting landholdings meant that most jute cultivators could not make enough money from sales of jute to secure basic subsistence. Impoverishment intensified during the extreme price collapses of the Depression decade of the 1930s and culminated in the Bengal famine of 1943-44, between 3 and 4 million Bengalis died of starvation. The Bengal famine was definitely engineered by the British Empire and its food policies during World War II, but was also a market-based famine when the price of subsistence rose much higher than than sources of income. The price of price of rice rose much higher than jute, and cultivators who depended on sales of jute to buy rice could not afford to buy sufficient rice. The relative prosperity, if there are questions about this process of immiseration, I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, but let me actually move on to what I think is and this has been written about by others. Iftikhar Iqbal, I recommend highly in writing about the sort of interwar period immiseration of the Bengal peasantry. But let me focus on my own argument about agrarian forms of Islam. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed the emergence of a new genre of printed text produced out of printing presses in small towns in the jute tracts, towns like Mymensingh, Rangpur, so forth. These tracts, many of them were focused on the question of peasant immiseration. Why were peasants becoming poor, and what was the way out of it? Many of these texts located poverty and peasant failures to practice Islam in their everyday lives, and their failure to follow an Islamic ethic in work, consumption, market engagements, attire, and bodily comportment, and especially in exercising patriarchal authority over women. These texts proposed programs of individual reform through which peasants could achieve this worldly salvation, an end or a reversal of the processes of immiseration. The most widely circulated agrarian Islamic texts were printed poems, a form of spoken poetry intended to be orally performed in public spaces. They consisted of several hundred lines of rhyming couplets of even beat. They were printed as cheap and flimsy chapbooks, low-quality thin paper bound loosely with thread and sold for a few annas. These texts signaled their Islamicness in their material form. They would have Allahu Akbar written in Arabic, in the cover. Some would open from the right, like an Arabic book. They would have longer quotations from the Quran or a hadith on the content of the book itself. Poems often opened with an invocation of Muslim peasant poverty. Abdul Aziz's poem Dunya or Akhirat Do Jahan Najat, Salvation in This World and the Next, opens looking at Muslims today, hi, hi, my heart explodes. Aziz then proceeds to ask and answer a series of rhetorical questions. Who are the beggars? Muslims. Who lose their lands and homes through debt? Muslims. Whose households are depleted by malaria, cholera, smallpox, plague? Muslims, so forth. Jute cultivation is identified as a primary cause of immiseration. Peasants often accuse jute of sowing excessive quantities of fibre out of greed. This is a atopat dili can tui chasha ebar pater chashe desh dubali ore buddhi nasha. Why did you sow so much jute, farmer? This time you drowned the country in jute, you brainless one. I've been telling you you won't get returns. You don't listen, farmers. You lost rice by sowing jute, you brainless ones. The main critique was really about sort of a smart set of engagements with the market. They weren't saying abjure from jute cultivation, abjure from markets. These texts were advising farmers, urging farmers to become more savvy in operating and engaging with markets, growing crops that command a better price, and most importantly, abjuring from those forms of consumption that had really underpinned the rise of jute in the late 19th century. These poems abound with a kind of homely wisdom to not spend frivolously. Behuda khoroj jeba korilo shaytaner bhai chhe hoilo. Those who spend frivolously are the brothers of Satan. Some of this sort of mockery of peasant consumption in this poetry extends. So this is the Albert cut as a sort of an object of these poets' criticisms of peasant consumption recurs frequently. The Albert cut I discovered is a hairstyle named for Prince Albert, or the consort of Queen Victoria, who had once visited British India. So this poet, Ashrafuddin Ahmed, whose Muslim Bani is published in Kumilla in 1927, wide মাথায় অ্যালবার্ট রাখা কেমন বাঁকা মালির ছাট অ্যালবার্টের তৈল দিতে তৈলর পড়ল বাট দেশ নাপিতের কাছে নাহি বসে আর শহরে দুই আনা দিয়ে ছাটায় বাহার. Peasants are accused of getting fancy Albert cuts, spending way too much oil, drowning the country in hair oil to keep their hair intact, and going to the cities for expensive haircuts rather than getting their hair cut with the village haircut at barber. This is the closest thing I could find to a photo of an Albert cut, but I couldn't find a farmer with an Albert cut. These forms of frivolous consumption are also related to a failure to exercise patriarchal authority. Peasants were accused of indulging women and children with gifts, spending lavishly on weddings, and spoiling them, making women and children exceptionally greedy and materialistic. There's a strong misogynistic streak in this poetry. The female counterpart to the peasant wearing the Albert cut, who's like lost his appearance of being a peasant and a Muslim, is the grasping and greedy, bad-tempered, bodmejaji, quarrelsome, jhograte, and unveiled, beparda peasant woman. Abdur Rahim's poem Nurul Islam relates poverty to men spoiling women with gifts and not disciplining properly, and then shows how these undisciplined women then impoverish the household. This body of literature essentially contains a self-help literature for rapidly impoverishing peasantry, but it also expresses a longing for a certain social ethic, a certain way of living in the world, which doesn't abjure markets, but reduces consumption, reduces redirects the self-makings to more homely Muslim appearances, if you will. My last theme, which I want to let me just read out. I think it's easier so I don't lose track. These agrarian Islamic boyans, however, did not circulate within a literate intelligentsia. The poem was a spoken poem, written down and mass-produced so as to be orally performed once more in more locations to larger audiences. The printed poem circulated between the town and the countryside, between spheres of textuality and orality. Through these circulation, these texts carved out a distinctive, discursive, and material space constituted by the production and circulation of jute and marked with an idioms and Islamic discourse related to the ideal conduct of a market entangled peasantry. The ideas and politics of Pakistan in Bengal, I argue, emerged out of this space, especially as this discourse, as this space carved out by production and markets, interacted with the very limited forms of electoral and representative politics introduced by the British. This is my last theme, and I'll be very quick in the interest of time. In 1919, the British Raj introduced very limited forms of representative and electoral politics into South Asia. They carved Bengal into separate Muslim and non-Muslim constituencies. In these communal constituencies, Muslim voters chose between Muslim candidates. Of the 76 constituencies in Bengal, 34 were categorized as rural Mohammedan. The 1935 Government of India Act extended the franchise and granted more substantive powers to elected representatives, but deepened the communal principle. 250 constituencies, 111 were designated rural Mohammedan. My book examines how the category rural Mohammedan as a voter or as a political representative category gains meaning, was invested with meaning as territorial constituency, as voter, and as electoral representative. How, through election campaigns, slogans, and posters, and in pamphlets, public speeches, and speeches on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, the rural Mohammedan gained significance. I argue that this political category of rural Mohammedan gained significance through the discourses of agrarian Islam, which had in turn grown up around an impoverishing peasantry and an unstable jute market. This quote I have up on the screen is from Shah Abdul Hamid's 1923 pamphlet, Shashon সংস্কারে গ্রাম্য Musulman, or rural Muslims and government reforms. By rural Muslim, we mean rural Muslim peasant. We must find similar people like us to vote for who belong to our class. This identification of peasant and Muslim in Bengal politics, I argue, was momentous. It meant that peasant politics would be the politics of Islam. The two would be completely entangled. And this is, I think, one of the defining features of the Pakistan movement. In Hamid's pamphlet, he rejects urbanity and urbane forms of consumption. He says, I quote, in his rejection, I reject smart umbrellas, babugiri ways, sly thoughts, beautiful mansions, dense dwellings, flirtatious smiles, babuyana shahebana, hats on black heads, and gates in front of empty houses. Instead, I embrace the village hovel is our rang mahal. The dim candle is our electric light. The winding narrow paths leading from one village to the next are our highways, and the village well, tank, pond, and lake are for us the pure tap water of the city. In the book, I examine how these meanings of the rural Mohammedan shifted during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and after World War II and famine, and came to focus on the idea of Pakistan as a peasant utopia, a land free of hunger and exploitation, of just prices and enriching markets, free of sin. Historians of South Asia have long argued that communal constituencies, the creation of separate Hindu and Muslim voters, led to a widening chasm between Muslims and Hindus in organized politics, a divergence in political aims and goals of the Muslim League and the National Congress, and ultimately the failures of negotiation and compromise which lead to partition and the making of Pakistan. I try to counter this top-down narrative with a bottom-up narrative, trying to show how communal constituencies, or the idea of the rural Mohammedan voter, was not merely imposed from above, but invested with meaning from below. And I argue that the category of rural Mohammedan as a political category was fleshed out through an agrarian Islamic discourse concerned in the first place with an agrarian economy enmeshed in global markets undergoing rapid immiseration. The book concludes with a chapter on partition and its aftermath. I will not go into too much detail, just, the facts that everyone knows. Partition carved out jute farms, separated it from the jute mills of Calcutta, and reconstituted the jute growing tracts of East Bengal as a new national economy, the national economy of Pakistan and East Bengal, if you will. My book examines how the Pakistani state attempted to transform jute from a colonial commodity into a national resource, which would produce revenue and strategic advantage for the post-colonial state. In the book, I pay close attention to Pakistan's state efforts to police and tax circulations of jute across newly drawn partition lines, and to cultivate a new class of crony capitalists who would constitute this national economy. But the identification of jute as the golden fibre dates from this period, as Pakistani propaganda insisting that this was no longer the source of colonial oppression, but now the source of national wealth. I'll stop there, and I'm sorry if I went on too long, but this is, I guess, a brief overview of the book, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone.
Thank you, Tariq Bhai, very much for this really kind of interesting presentation of history of jute involving Bengal peasant. I want to try to summarize. We'll go straight to questions now. Can you just put your hand up if you want to ask a question? Yes, Naomi?
Hi, Naomi.
Unmute, please. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry. It's a long time since I've used Zoom. Thank you so much, Awdullah, for organizing this. Thank you so much, Tariq, for coming and giving this tremendous talk. Two questions. One is the 1880s. Can you hear me okay? The 1880s depression. What role did that play in the early phase of the development of jute in the region? And the second question is, harking back to work that you and I talked about and thought about and did a bit of many years ago in Bangladesh. To what extent would you describe the kind of the economic critique by these poets as a kind of a version of the moral economy?
Let me begin with the 1880s depression. Until World War One, farmers would respond to price. Farmers had the ability to shift between jute and rice. So when the 1880s jute prices collapsed, we see a sharp fall in jute cultivation the next year and a sharp rise in rice cultivation the next year. The same would happen again. The same had already happened in the 1870s, and the same would happen again in the 1890s. And so basically between 1850, when you start seeing the rise actually take place, till about 1914, it sort of goes in this steady, it's always rising, but through ups and downs. After the big expansion between 1905 and 1914 takes place during a period of very shrinking farm sizes. This is when we start seeing farm sizes start shrinking, and cultivators adopt a much more market-dependent subsistence livelihoods. So they're no longer growing enough rice to secure subsistence and then jute, but they're rather growing jute to secure subsistence. So when the price collapses then start happening, we start noticing a much greater stickiness. They're unable to shift to rice because their only hope of survival in many ways is to secure enough rice from sales of jute. And also around this time, we see the rise of the moneylender and the debt traps. So if we see the retreat of the landlord in the 1880s, we see the rise of the moneylender in the early 1900s, the late 1890s. And that in itself is linked to jute because jute cultivation is financed by moneylenders who have been coming in larger quantities. So that's why we sort of are able to see more flexibility, and how this sort of flexibility kind of erodes over time as part of the story of jute, certainly. In terms of moral economy, I mean, it's very much a moral economy, I think, kind of a framework that I'm providing. In terms of, the language of just prices is very much there throughout. But what I'm amazed in the poems is that how much of it shifts the burden onto the cultivators rather than to price setters. So it's cultivators' obligation to be able to navigate uncertain prices. They should be able to forecast what the future prices should be. I didn't go into details, but many of these pamphlets are you are too reliant on a single crop. You should grow a range of cash crops, including sugar, mustard oil, and so forth. And I think which also shows that none of these people are farmers because none of them take seriously the amount of extra labor required for each different plant. They none of just don't take it seriously. So and what I'm also very interested in is how much of it is directed at the peasant household as a space constituted by the consumption of certain goods and about household relations. So it's really it's more like Weberian and Protestant ethic instead of a outward. I mean, I feel like moral economy at least leads to a critique of the state. So much of this is leading to a critique of peasant society and peasant domesticity.
Next one. Any other people? Hena, you always like to ask questions, don't you?
Did you say my name?
Yeah.
I would love to ask a question. Thank you so much. That was like amazing. I'm gonna go buy your book and read it because I love the I guess Marxist lens you've applied to it. It's so interesting seeing it in a South Asian context. I guess I'd love to hear more about how, yeah, these critiques of jute and consumption intersected with movements for independence. I think you briefly touched on it, so I would love to hear more.
I mean, no, absolutely. So, I mean, if we do the first, the jute cultivating peasantry participated in the Gandhian non-cooperation Khilafat movement as perhaps one of the major initial mass movements of the peasantry in that period. So, I mean, I'll put it this way. So in the book, I describe how jute cultivators stayed away from the Swadeshi movement of 1905 to 1913, and in fact engaged in fights with Swadeshi nationalists. And in the Swadeshi movement of 1905-1913, we see Swadeshi nationalists who are mostly Hindu going into rural marketplaces and destroying consumer goods or preventing acts of pleasurable consumption in a period when jute prices are high and consumerism is beneficial to peasants. These attempts to prevent consumption then erupt into massive, what are described in the communal record as communal violence, as Hindu-Muslim violence, but which I argue are Muslim cultivators trying to protect practices of pleasurable consumption, of entertainment, trying to keep the fair and marketplace as a place of kind of pleasure, safe from these urban Hindus, Hindu Bhadralok, who are coming with a nationalist mission. And also the Swadeshi movement portrays jute cultivators as betrayers of the nation. They portrays them as people who are enriching themselves at the expense of the greater nation by not producing goods that are demanded locally, but by producing goods that are demanded globally. So at this point, we have a sort of a nationalist jute cultivators really kind of opposed to each other. 10 years later, World War I has happened. The process of immiseration has started. Gandhi begins the non-cooperation. I mean, Gandhi and the Ali brothers and the non-cooperation Khilafat movement begins in East Bengal in 1920. This is a period just after World War I. Jute prices, market turbulence is ongoing. There's a serious food crisis. Food prices are high, jute prices are low. And Gandhi comes with a message not just of market abstinence, not just of abjuring consumer goods. He also lectures against growing jute. He lectures people against growing jute, but this is more receptive at this point because jute is not a remunerative crop at this moment in history. And things are very expensive. And his sort of abjuring from consumption in markets makes sense when you can't afford to consume the marketplace goods, right? Because you just don't have the money. You're going through immiseration. But more importantly, I argue, it's not just the economics, it is also the vision. Gandhi's vision of Swaraj, reinterpreted through Muslim lenses, reinterpreted through the Khilafat cause, sets the agrarian scene on fire. And for about 6 months, the British Raj loses effective authority over the over the jute tracts, and it's only very slowly replaced. So I would say that's kind of the early story. The latest story I try to present today, of course, is how the British sort of reform constitutional process sort of was able to absorb jute cultivators into their limited forms of politics through this category of rural Mohammedan.
Next one. Anybody else?
So much.
Georgie, you like to ask questions, don't you?
Hi, sorry. Hi, Tariq, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I do have your book, and I'm always wanting to delve into it, but I haven't managed to do it. I suppose it's an inevitable question, bearing in mind everything that you've been talking about, but and the first image that you showed. But can you say a little bit about women in this story?
I mean, that's a very good point. Very good sort of question. One of the argument, the women are located as part of the peasant household complex, which is a sort of a body of labor. One of the arguments is the increase of jute cultivation in the late 19th century takes place to the greater exploitation of women's labor within the peasant household, because just like as you keep adding crops, the amount of work increases. And also market declines are also accompanied by greater sort of exploitation of women's and children's labor within the household, because when market prices, you might have hired outside labor to strip jute or in the drying and processing of jute, but if the prices are low and you don't have the money, you'll have women and children do it in the homestead. So there's a way in which jute prices and women's labor within the household is related to each other. But secondly, I think, and more importantly, in the period of sort of collapse, in the period of immiseration, when the agrarian economy has lost sustainability, and this literature of this new sort of peasant Islamic literature is emerging, a lot of it is about women being the source of men's downfall. It is a very misogynistic literature. And a lot of the literature it's really about patriarchal control over women's consumption habits on one hand, and it's also about taking away, and I didn't talk about it in my presentation, but some of these poems have long sections attacking women's income earning activities. So there's one poem which is a long section about, long diatribe, about several hundred lines, about all the evils that follow if a woman sells eggs in her homestead. If she sells eggs in her homestead, a strange man will enter the homestead to buy the egg, leading to certain kinds of corruption. She will have an income spent on her own, leading to all other kinds of corruption. So in many ways, this literature is really about, in this moment of immiseration, men should restrict, and you would think they should try and increase their sources of income, but actually it's the contrary. It really is about squeezing and controlling women much more to ensure men's control over women's bodies as the peasant economy collapses.
We have some colleagues here who have actually did some research and written chapters, right? Yeah. Hilary, would you like to ask anything? Are you there? No respond. Alison, can you hear me? Oh, Hilary is talking here. Hilary, can you unmute, please? Alison, are you there? I think
she just wrote in the chat that she's got neither a mic nor a camera.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry about this. Alison, are you there? Okay. Who else would like to ask questions?
My only question is, you've talked a lot about the jute as a commodity for sales, but is there any about the the usage and the consumption within the community itself? Or was it solely used as a crop to generate money?
Solely uses the crop to generate money. Many of these poems begin that you can't eat your jute. So jute used to be, before it was grown in a large-scale commercial fashion for export, it used to be grown in small quantities, usually near the homestead, for just for local ropes and little bags, like the local use for the household as a use value. But once it became a mass crop, it was almost solely so it certainly did not add to the peasant economy or the rural economy. It was solely for export or solely for factory manufacturing in a factory. It was sold Calcutta factory or Dundee factory or factory anywhere in the world.
Martin,
sorry,
go on.
I was going to say, like, I have been, there's a farmer's market where I live in DC, and there's a Caribbean farmer who sells jute jute leaves there. And I guess it's a young jute leaf. So when jute is thin, the young jute leaf is used as a green. And unlike in Egypt, where the jute leaf is grown only as a green and not as a fiber. And in the Caribbean too, I think, from what I understand from the person I buy patshak from, it's used as a greens, as a kind of a pot herb rather than a. Here we go. Is this the patshak?
Yes, I've grown this at home. Right?
Oh, fabulous!
On the window, you can see.
Oh, fabulous! Amazing.
Sorry, carry on. Yeah, I just wanted to show you this.
No. Thank you. That was perfect.
Can I say, I think that you've only considered the poor Muslims in Pakistan and Bangladesh, but you really haven't considered all the poor women and children in Dundee who worked for next to nothing. And maybe, I don't know that the government thought too much about what the politics of it, but certainly if the jute owners made money, the people didn't, and the people were like slaves. They were going about without shoes, they had very few clothes, there were lots of accidents, and they really were not living in luxury. So it's not like India versus Britain.
Certainly not. That wasn't my intention to. If that's what came across as my intention, that was not my intention at all. I feel like if we talk about immiserated workforces around the world linked by a commodity, I think we can certainly talk about that. I have read Gordon Stewart's book. I've been to Dundee, and of course, like the racialized, largely Irish workforce, largely feminized workforce of Dundee, with its counterpoint of the workforce in the Calcutta mills, with its counterpoint of many different sort of laboring communities exploited and immiserated, tied together in a commodity chain, is certainly the history of jute. I mean, there's no denying that, and I would not even try to deny that.
Any other?
Mohammed, can I ask a question? Is
Yes,
Abdul Kalam Aziz here? Hi there. I'm just in and out, just popping in, seeing, really fascinated from what I managed to grasp and catch. I wanted to, you kind of touched upon like superstition and, like the egg and the woman, and then stories and literature in that way. Is there more kind of any kind of research regarding jute and faith, or jute and superstition, or taboo cultures, that sort of thing?
No. So superstition. I don't know. I mean, no. Actually, I don't know. I don't know if jute horror stories or jute. There must be some
horror.
Jute,
Sorry. What I mean is
that like supers, like I don't know, like folk tales. There must be. So there is. I mean, like I haven't looked into it. I do know from my time in villages that the jute farm or the jute field is a space where people go to do all kinds of naughty things, because you can't see through it. There's something about a visual barrier of the jute field. So there is that aspect of jute and how the jute field in a landscape. But the discourse of jute is very much part of a rationalizing discourse, because it leads people to market calculations. It leads people to be like, this is one of the critiques of jute, is that you can't eat it. It carries no spiritual or material substance value to you. Its only value is as a price. So it becomes this very sort of rationalizing kind of force in society because you can only see jute as a price. Does that
And
help?
was there any references you found about, like idols or Hindu kind of sculptures made with clay or jute, or even in Egyptology?
Yeah.
No. Oh, well, thank you for that. I found it very interesting. So thank you very much.
John, did you want to ask something?
Yes, sorry, I'd love to. I can't find the hand gestures thing on my screen. That was absolutely fascinating. I knew nothing about it. I came into this conversation partly because I lived and worked in Hamlets for 40 years, and now I'm in Ireland, where not only, as you and Anne have said, that provided a lot of the workforce in Dundee, but there was also a very big jute factory in the south of Ireland and so on. So I'm interested in those connections. But what I wasn't sure I'd understood properly was the price of jute more volatile than other primary commodities? And I'm particularly interested in how it might relate to tea and sugar and things that were produced under colonial coercion, as you put it. So how does it relate?
Yeah, the question. I think so. I mean, they're all, each of these commodities have their own sort of histories of when they begin. Jute and tea sort of grow mass. The late 19th century, they become mass commodities almost parallelly. So there is somehow, as far as, I mean, again, I haven't done the research. I think an economist can look at the price series and like tell you very quickly which commodities are more volatile than the other. But I'll give you my basic impression. During the late 19th century, we see a pretty secular rise in sort of these prices of primary commodities with ups and downs that roughly correlate between the commodities. During the Great Depression, the price operates jute prices are much more volatile than sugar and tea prices because sugar and tea gets effective cartels. The Indian Tea Association operates as a cartel to prevent tea prices from falling too much during the Great Depression. Jute farmers can't come together to form a cartel for raw jute prices. Jute manufacturers come together to form a cartel for manufactured jute prices. So the ability to form cartels, which we see more and more of which we see examples of it during the Depression, leads to jute being more price volatile because jute farmers are never able to organize in that way. But I think this is a question that a good economist would have a much better answer to your question than
Thank you. Anyways, brilliant talk.
There's a question from someone asking, was there anyone looking out for peasants since they were essential in supplying the market demands?
So, I mean, yes. I mean, in many ways, colonial policy was about stabilizing a peasantry. By stabilizing, I mean ensuring, like, the colonial state was worried that it was concerned that each year peasants must go back to the field and produce so much jute, which required a minimal to stabilize it, to make sure it happened. So one of the things the colonial government did was hobble zamindari power in the 1885 landlord bill. But in the process, of course, they ended up empowering moneylenders. So there's a process by which, there's a sort of a weird sort of colonial incentive to look after the peasants. More importantly, perhaps, is the rise of Bengali Muslim peasant politics in the 1920s and 30s, led by people like A.K. Fazlul Haq, who would become known as Shere Bangla, who would position himself as the champion of the Bengal peasantry, who would conduct himself in sort of Bengal nationalist politics as the representative of the Bengali Muslim peasant. So in terms of who was looking after the peasant, I think we have at various times people claiming to be the voice of the peasant, or claiming to be the protector of the peasant, or claiming to be the father of the. But I think in many ways, in many cases, this was self-interested. They weren't doing it for the sake of the peasantry, and in many cases, it was, in many cases, the peasants. I mean, they had to rise up and take care of their own, right? They had to, and they did frequently rise up to make their own demands.
There's a supplementary question from the same person. Also, if women were subdued, was it not to the detriment of the cultivators? Any noticeable changes happen?
I mean, this is a problem, I think, with being a historian who studies things, who can't get a very detailed view into like what's happening at a very micro level. Um, uh, so, I mean, I'll come to the disease question, which is also very interesting. So the detriment to the cultivators during this period is huge. I mean, we're talking about a period of mass immiseration where a peasant class that was largely had not experienced poverty and famine suddenly is thrust into extreme conditions of hunger and poverty very rapidly. So the detriment of the cultivators is a broad condition, which is both causing these men to believe that they need to control their women, and which is probably also causing further detriment to their condition. So there's something there about the exercise of increasing poverty, leading to increased sort of exercise of patriarchal control, leading perhaps to even more increased poverty. There's something there in that logic that perhaps an economist can address better than I can. From our broad view, it's hard to disaggregate causes of what's driving poverty. It's definitely a combination of factors. Diseases that prevailed: Kala-Azar, cholera, malaria were major. Iftikhar Iqbal writes very, very well about how British railway construction, driven in large part by the need to bring jute outside, blocked the region's waterways, causing sort of what the delta used to drain very well into the sea, but the delta stops draining as well, leading to stagnant bodies of water and increasing incidences of waterborne disease. And there are many figures to show that there were deaths occurring through disease. This has been well written by Iftikhar Iqbal, if you want to look into it further. But yes, there's a public health crisis that is raging, and that begins roughly in the 10s and 20s. It becomes a popular saying in East Bengal in this period that more railways is more malaria.
Raila had looked at your book. I think she read parts of it. Raila, would you like to ask anything? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Actually, can I ask something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So what I want to ask is, you presented an oscillation between cultivation of jute and cultivation of rice. One fell, one rose until about, I think you mentioned 1905. So it sounds like you're talking about a kind of a monoculture cultivation, but firstly, is that correct? And what else were they growing at the same time in the same area?
So the way the statistics prove like this it is two major cash crops that are grown by the rice and jute. There's also a winter crop of mustard oil, vegetable seeds, and so forth. So there are three major crops.
Sure.
Distributing these crops across time and space is a trick, right? Certain lands are suited to certain crops. Certain crops have to be planted in the winter. Certain crops have to be planted in. So the rhythm of it was like this. So jute is sown around at the same time as Aush rice is sown, spring rice. So you got to choose at that point, how much land do I want to put under Aush and how much land do I want to put under jute? They both sort of mature during the monsoons, and they both have this amazing quality of growing faster than the water rises. So, and they're both harvested around the same time, and around which time cultivators are also preparing the seed beds for the almond rice. So labor has to be split between harvesting jute, preparing jute from harvest to fibre, preparing the almond seedlings, harvesting the Aush. You've already harvested the Aush and marketed it by this point, probably. Almond is planted after the jute is withdrawn. Almond does not grow well on land that has just been cleared of jute. But this doesn't, as land grows scarcer, as land use grows more intensive, farmers start planting almond, double cropping jute with almond, which results in reducing almond yields, so reducing almond productivity. So almond you've planted, now you're waiting for the winter rice to ripen. Around the time you harvest the almond, you're also doing your winter crops of spices, oil seeds, mustard mostly, vegetables, vegetables mostly have a local market, so you're not really growing extensive vegetables for sale. And then again, like after you harvest that, you're waiting for the spring rains, and you're making another set of decisions about how much land during which time between these crops. So that's the overall large sort of peasant crop choice in a very generalized format.
Great, thank you.
Which jute is like one. So growing more jute in every respect will mean growing less something, because you have to divert land and labor from those two jutes.
Yeah, and are they also spending a lot of time? I mean, like, for example, when you're planting almond and you're knowing that the yield is going to be lower because of jute, they must have been trying other ways to kind of counteract that to increase the fertility. So how did things like growing mustard, because sometimes, things like mustard is also kind of dug back into, mulched back into the soil. Does that
fertility fixing crops? So that's what grows. That's fertility. So fertility fixing crops used to be mostly pasture crops, the mashkolai and stuff like that you would feed cattle or you would let mulch back in. So with jute cultivation, land use gets more intensive.
Yeah.
Land use gets more intensive.
Much bigger workforce because of that as well.
And also the suffers, right? It's the leaving fallows, growing nitrogen fixing crops. And a lot of the literature is about the reduction in milk production that has accompanied.
I was actually about to ask you about the animals on the farms and how that affects. So you're saying it was the milk yields were much lower because of that.
There's a lot of literature about it, right? There's a lot saying that we don't have as much milk as we used to because pastures have been taken over by jute farms.
Can I ask Dr. Shoban Adnan, who has done quite a bit of work on rural Bengal, to engage in the discussion, ask some questions or something like that? Can you hear me, Dr. Shoban Adnan? Can you hear? We can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Have I unmuted myself?
Yes.
It's unmuted now. Yeah, you can start.
Okay. I was going to ask several questions. Tariq, I should say that I haven't been able to go through the entire book as thoroughly as I would like. So I may not be able to do justice to Tariq and his book, but I have, let's say, 3 points to make. The first one is about the reversal in the role of the provincial or mofussil towns. The argument that I seem to understand is that initially these were dominated by the professional classes of the Hindu Bhatralok, who were oriented towards Calcutta for ideas, for political ideas, and also cultural norms. And you quote Aurobindo Ghosh to that effect. Now, you then bring in the next phase where there is in-migration by Muslims, wealthy, educated Muslims from the countryside. And this then leads to a contestation of the domination of the Kolkata metropolitan culture and politics. My question here is this merely a function of the demographic change in the religious composition of immigrants to mofussil towns from villages, or is there more to it than simply that religious difference in religious composition? My second question is about money lending practices, and this in part relates to Sugata Ghosh's work. Why is it that in the 1930s you have moneylenders calling in loans rather than letting them roll? Now, you mention in your book that there is a liquidity crisis going on, but is it only the liquidity crisis? Is there more to this? So I would like you to elaborate on that. My third and last point is about, and there is more actually, but this is the one that I will stop with.
We'll come back.
This stereotyping of quarrelsome, divisive women. Women are portrayed as as basically irresponsible and greedy and responsible for impoverishment of the peasant household by their demands for extravagant gifts and so on. Now, my question is, in the entirety of this literature, this if this Boyan literature or Puthi literature, are there no alternative profiles of women? For example, at least there would be pious and religious women who read the Quran and follow all the Sharia laws. But in addition, is there anything remotely approaching, uh, more loving men-women relationships, more respectful ones, anything like the Vaishnava views, or is this Muslim peasant literature entirely devoid of that dimension?
That's a
Thank you.
fair. Let me begin with the last question. This view, this sort of misogynistic view, I think I argue is a specific response to the specific conditions of immiseration. It is not like a general view of the peasantry, but in the conditions of immiseration, what I want to argue is that control over women's bodies and labor become much more contested or like much more difficult, right? So this is like an attempt to regain what people are perceiving as losing control over women within the household. There is certainly Puthi literature, Mufassal literature, which has modernizing women, modern views of women, educating. There's a little movement about educating women. Rokeya Sultana is inspiring her own separate literature. I have focused on one part of that literature in the book at the expense of others, which is the peasant immiseration literature, the literature that seeks to explain the causes of poverty. And that literature, from what I have seen, is very much concerned about patriarchal control. And I think it comes out of a fear that poverty means that men will not be able to control women's reproductive bodies as social reproduction as strongly. And this, as the questions are so good, I've forgotten. The second one was to do with.
One was on money lending practices, the second one, and the first one was about the Mopussul town and demographic recomposition.
Yes, the money lending practices and why in the 1930s did the money lenders call in their debts, and because the answer I think is because there is the desire to take over land ownership, desire to take over the deeds of peasant property becomes much more acute during this period of liquidity crisis. And there is this sort of, and it grows. I mean, it will increase until the Bengal Moneylenders Act, which prevents moneylenders from taking over peasant property. So I think what we're seeing is an attempt to take over peasant land, which is something we hadn't seen in earlier phases of economic collapse and when debt becomes an issue where you just let it roll over and you continue debt bondage. But the desire to take over titles of land and reduce cultivators to sharecroppers on their former lands becomes a more acceptable sort of means of recovering debt around this period. Why that happens? I mean, Shugoto Bose's explanation is the liquidity crisis. I think there's something, maybe an alternative explanation. I just thought about it in response to is Iftikhar Iqbal argues about the return of the Bhodro look to the agrarian economy in Bengal in the late 30s and 40s, where sort of investment opportunities for Bengali middle class in the urban areas and employment opportunities for Bengali middle class in the urban areas are drying up. So they see a possibility of coming back to the agrarian economy as a rentier class. So we might be seeing a larger part of that as well. A new emergence of a new rentier class in the land economy may also be an explanation. It will be interesting to follow. The second question about is it just demographics? It is also about, I think it is about this idea of rurality as a set of values, which is what the Grammo Sanskare, the Shashon Shankare Grammo Mushalman pamphlet talks about. Or if you read the Legislative Assembly debates in colonial Bengal, you will see East Mufassal and rural candidates from East Bengal, both Hindu and Muslim, coming together in a joint platform against Calcutta repeatedly. They will say things like, you are appropriating, the appropriations from rural Bengal to urban Calcutta were very hotly contested. And in those budget discussions, when they would like question every single grant made to the Calcutta Improvement Trust by saying, you are sucking jute cultivators' blood to pave Calcutta's road with macadam, rural Bengali Muslims and Hindus from rural constituencies would come together. And there is a sense that a mufassal politics, an anti-Calcutta politics, oriented not oriented towards Calcutta, but like also taking its inspirations from elsewhere, are coming not just from religious sentiments, but from a larger sort of a revolt against the metropolis, if you will.
I want to ask you a question. There's a section in the book where you talked about a family who lost their land, through indebtedness and what's the word, eviction, right, from the land. They departed for Assam to cultivate, in Assam. Can you just say something about the scale of movement of East Bengal peasant into Assam, to engage in jute cultivation, and what were the incentives? I mean, one thing I was thinking was there a direct attempt to force many peasants from East Bengal, to actually migrate to Assam to open up the jungles along the Brahmaputra Valley, yeah?
So there's the number of Bengali farmers who move up the Brahmaputra from Mymensingh and Rangpur, but not just up the Brahmaputra, also across the Tripura border, by the way, in the same period, across the Tripura border into the Tripura valleys and hills is huge. We're probably talking in the hundreds of thousands of Bengali Muslim farmers who moved into the Brahmaputra Valley and into the Tripura valleys between the Tripura hill ranges. Laili Uddin, who I'm sure all of you are aware of, is doing I just heard her present her chapter talking about this migration and how the Assam government managed it and how Maulana Bhashani's origins from this migration from up the Brahmaputra to Bhashani Chor, and it was a fabulous, fabulous talk. So she'd give a much more better nuanced history of this. The scale is huge. The general argument is that it is caused by immiseration. The example I provide in my book, it's once you've lost your assets here that you're forced to migrate up. And that's the narrative that is used in the literature of the time. I think we need a much more proper history, a much more detailed history, which I haven't done, of this migration to really understand the various drivers of it. Was it really people who lost everything and then migrated? Were there people who maintained homes on one side and invested extra capital to set up farms on the other side? What ways it can... So I think there's a lot of research to be done to understand how these migrations happened, how these sort of clearance of jungles into farms were financed. The one thing that I think from the literature is, I think this is true for much of Bengal peasant history. The British Raj played a more reactive role than a proactive role. The Bengal peasantry took decisions on their own that made sense to them in their lives, and the British Raj was often left sort of scrambling a response. So I think from what I can make out from my literature that the financing of it, the arrangement of it were coming from peasant society itself rather than being forced upon peasant society from atop. Whether it was certainly being driven partly by immiseration, but it could also partly be being driven by, immiseration is also differentiation, new sources of capital, new sources of loans, new ways of financing a move across into the jungles to clear land to build farms. So
what about engineering and incentivizing?
But I don't know if the Raj would have played a critical role in that as much as an agrarian economy composed of Marwari moneylender, Bengali Muslim. The energy and capital may have come just from there rather than... The Raj was already limiting Bengali farmers from migrating before World War II. They created a line system saying Bengalis can only settle, because the Assam government had become very upset already by the mid-1940s at this huge numbers of Bengalis coming in. So the Raj was already trying to restrict it even before the British Empire ended. They didn't, of course, cut it off entirely. There's lots of tax revenue for them, but they were worried about containing it.
Just one more related question. You said they went lot of farmers went to Tripura as well. What did they do there? With this jute cultivation or some other rice?
Rice. I mean, it's rice and jute. I think there's no such thing as a pure jute cultivator. I think even the most pure jute cultivator sows more rice than jute. Like even, so in the balance of land, like there'll be more rice than jute. But yeah, a combination rice jute in both the Assam Valley and in the Tripura valleys.
Any more questions? It's been quite fascinating. I think everybody, not many people know much about this field, so it's really new, right? But some people in our group have read your book, and they found, real good introduction to an area they never kind of knew. We don't want to stay longer than people want. Are there any more questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's not so much a question as an inquiry about, because for me, I came from a completely different angle. I was interested in the fibers, but I also come from a French peasant background where I could see totally how it already operated like multinationals do now, that instead of buying flax and hemp, that was like I remember my granny, it only stopped in my granny's time, the cultivation of hemp, so First World War. But my question is also about educational, because where does that go? Because me, I'm not so much an academic at all. I can grasp it, but there is also a need of how we pass on the information to other people, because it can stay in very special circle. And I think the stories really need to be told to children or whatever in ways that could make them understand how it works, because it's still the same nowadays with multinationals.
It's still
just to say something, Tariq. Claire joined our craft group, right? Yeah, she's got these amazing skills. She's sitting in our group, and within an hour or so, she produced some beautiful stuff, right? Yeah, and I was just wondering, how did she do it? Okay, sorry.
Even now, as we are talking, I've been twining.
Oh wow!
I'm still twining because it's one way of occupying the mind, But are there any plans to have? Because I could almost see like children's book, or for me, it's very much what do you do with all that information? Because it really needs to be disseminated to young people in a more palatable form that's not just academic.
It's not a boring history book that no, I hear you. I absolutely hear you. So I mean, I'll just say there. I mean, I really like the exhibition photos I've seen, and they look fab. So I think this sort of material visual histories are very, very powerful, and the ways in which Mahmoudullah Bhai, the photos he sent, like the way the sack is these are very powerful visual images that you have created as Stepney Community Trust, and I think it's really, really cool. I want to warn against one way of remembering jute history that is quite common in Bangladesh. So when I was doing my research in Bangladesh, everyone asked me, will I bring jute back? And I had to reply that, no, I'm just a historian. I'm going to write about jute in the past. But it always struck me, why do contemporary Bangladeshis want to bring jute back? I have read this entire literature about how jute was a symbol of colonial exploitation and how rice was the national crop that would restore national vigor. And now we're confronted by a Bangladeshi kind of public discourse about how jute should come back and contribute to Bangladeshi. It's our indigenous crop. And I was wondering why. So I guess my answer to that was there's something about the jute industry and the way it was organized that is a critique of the garments industry. It serves as a critique of just in time. It was an indigenous crop that was grown in the soil and then finished at Adamji jute mills using a unionized male labor force. There's a vision of a certain economy in that jute industry that is set up in Pakistan times that is very unlike the garments industry, where it's casualized labor, feminized labor, only the sowing and the labor is done in Bangladesh, whereas everything else is imported. There's a critique of neoliberalism incipient in this jute nostalgia. But I guess why I'm saying this is, as we think of how to make exhibitions or present the history of jute in other forms, we don't fall into traps of nostalgizing jute, which is what I think the Bangladeshi elite classes tend to do, but rather like have a much more critical view of it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Mona, did you want to ask something? Mona? Got your hand up, right? She's got a question on the chat, yeah?
But surely jute, I think I heard what you said, but jute being such a natural fiber and knowing that we are facing such big problems with the plastic industry, I'm sure there are new ways of processing it or things that we are not yet seen that would be very ecologically viable.
Yes. I mean, yes, I don't know enough about this.
Right.
But I'll say this, like, I mean, yes, say that jute is going to help us get out of plastics and hydrocarbons. Is it in our national economic interest to replace rice with jute yet again?
All right, yeah.
I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, like these are histories. I think I don't have an answer about what jute's future should be, but I just want to be I want to be more critical of jute's history than our sort of popular histories of just like, oh, jute was lovely. It was ours. It was our golden fiber. The golden fiber history, which I want to portray as Pakistani propaganda, to serve a particular interest of the Pakistani political class. Let's not replay that history yet again, is I guess my warning. But which is why what I've seen of the Stepney Community Trust exhibitions, it's showing jute next to the Lashkar. It's doing a working person's jute history and not this sort of, oh, jute is the national wealth of a nation. I think what the Stepney Community Trust is doing with jute is much more sophisticated already.
You see, we were asked by people to actually help create business, in London. But we told them we are no business people. We don't know how to do business. We're only interested in the heritage and history. I think I think we'll end here because we're not getting any more questions, and you covered a lot, and the questions were really good, helped us explore some areas kind of deeper. And just to say, Laili Uddin, she actually gave a talk on this migration in one of our events in East London. She actually gave about maybe 4 or 5 talks over the years, right? And some of them are actually online, in YouTube, right? So yes, we know her quite well. Yeah, Tariq, thank you very much. I think we'll end here. Really appreciate, and many people who have got your book, they're reading, and I hope our publicity will increase the sale of your book.
Thank you. If I sell 2 books, I consider it an amazing achievement.
Yeah. No, already we got quite a few people have, and those who haven't bought his book, please do, because it's really good. It will give you really good insight to a missing thing, right? The life of Bengali peasants and how their life was like, what he uses the word entangled, right? To the global capitalist ups and down through the British Empire's need for jute. Okay, just to before we finish, just one point, Tariq, right? Is the British Empire needed jute. They needed more and more jute, right? So, and in order to produce more and more jute, you needed to get more peasants, to cultivate more jute, to produce more jute. Even if the Raj didn't kind of directly, but who incentivized, who created there's always behind the scene people trying to develop policies to encourage more production. And because I think, was it your book or someone else's book? I think your book mentioned something about the British bringing rice from Burma, to help meet the deficit.
So, I mean, the amazing thing is that, what is it, 1872, 73, there's a letter from the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal to his private secretary saying, "What is this jute? Have never heard of it. I don't know where the word comes from. Is it an English word or a Bangla word? Da 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 da." And by that time, jute has already expanded hugely. Jute's expansion seemed to have happened under the empire's radar. First, the Dundee mill manufacturers took the decision during the Crimean War to switch to jute. And then Marwari traders or Indian traders were able to bring seemingly unlimited quantities of jute to Calcutta for sale for these ships going to Dundee. And these Bengali farmers seemed to be able to grow even more and more jute as much as so this seemed to be happening without the British Empire's notice. So the British Empire seemed to be playing catch up all the time with jute, right? Like, where is this coming from? And their concerns very quickly unlike, say, with indigo and opium, and tea certainly, where they were like, how are we going to keep increasing production? Their concerns very quickly went to quality and how peasants are supposedly, or indigenous traders are manipulating quality to cheat white capitalists. This is why we must regulate jute, because these farmers and capitalists are cheating us. So it became less about increasing production and much more about control over the supply chain. Supply quantity concerns arose in the 1900 to 19 when the demand exploded. And that's when, around the time British is setting up its sort of agrarian science, its sort of agricultural science parts. So they set up jute experimental farms. They start experimenting with better varieties of jute, higher yielding varieties of jute. But they never came up with anything. There's no technology that they actually devised which was useful to the farmer in like 30 years of trying. Whatever like production methods the farmers use is what continued. And if there was any kind of mechanism which tried to keep farmers from switching back to rice from jute, there really wasn't a mechanism in place. But the moneylenders was perhaps the only mechanism. But all of the available evidence we have is that most loans weren't tied to, I'm giving you a loan, you have to produce jute. It was, I'm giving you a loan, you'll pay me back on harvest day, whether it's jute or rice. You decide which one's likelier to get me my loan back. So it's a very strange crop where we can see not much colonial fixing. And this is strange. It's not usual. I think in most cases you'll see much more intensive effort by the empire to make sure that they kept producing it. Over here, it seems that things happened. The empire like retroactively responded, and we ended up with an impoverished agrarian economy with people producing jute mainly because they didn't have a choice. It was their it was an uncertain bet on securing subsistence.
I think thank you very much, right? Yes, so we'll end here definitely, right? We can ask any more question. Now we really appreciate, right? You spending your valuable time to talk to us, and we will send you a copy of our book by post. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And okay, yeah, thank you, and thank you the audience who joined and asked interesting questions and help improve our understanding of the whole thing. And I think we'll this nostalgia, jute nostalgia, I think it will continue. I think what people are saying, okay, we used so much of our land, to grow jute, so much suffering, but we didn't benefit in the past, right? As a country, there was no investment, infrastructure, all this kind of thing. There was consumption, as you pointed out, which gave enjoyment, but there was nothing permanent, no investment, education, things like that, that we can talk about. And when the British left Bengal, Bangladesh, East Pakistan was one of the poorest places in the world. India was also very poor, generally. Whereas when the British came in, India, Bengal was relatively rich from that time's point of view. So I think what people are saying that, so this potential, this fiber exists, and can we benefit from this fiber now? Because in the past we didn't, everyone else did. Yeah. So okay, thank you very much, Tariq. Right, and we'll be in touch, and hopefully you are going to produce something more that we can benefit from. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Right. So I'll
Thank
I'll
you.
end
Thank
the
you.
event now.